Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video. And oh boy, is this gonna be an interesting one. Do you want to get a bunch of maces for you and your friends? Are you having trouble to get these elusive Windburst books for your brand new mace? Or maybe you just want to get a bunch of diamonds without having to mine anything? Well, today I will show you how to do just that, and while being completely AFK. I left the game running overnight and this was the result. Who wouldn't want to wake up to 6 double chests full of goodies? This used roughly 4 stacks of keys, which means I was opening 20 volts per hour, and I was getting roughly 1.5 mace per hour. Sounds great, right? Well, we'll get into how I designed such a farm in just a moment. But before that, I would like to really apologize for not uploading a video in so long. Basically, I have a full-time job and a few more incoming IRL things that are making it difficult for me to find time to work on videos. And these videos take a lot of time and effort to make. Again, really sorry, but I'm actually working on a few interesting videos, so stay tuned for when these are released. But enough of all that. I am so pleased to finally present you a completely AFK Ominous Vault farm. It uses the chunk save setting mechanic we talked about in the previous video on the subject. Go check that video out if you haven't seen it. We are gonna expand on the idea and make it fully automatic so you don't have to be in front of your PC while you are farming these vaults. I would just like to mention that this farm is a bit complex, so be prepared for that. But since the reward is farmable diamonds and maces, it's probably worth it, don't you think? So, do you want to build the same farm in your own world? Well, I've got you covered, as it is the point of this video. But there's a few things you should know about the farm before thinking of building it, including how the farm works, so you can easily troubleshoot it yourself if something isn't working, as well as which version of the farm you should build and potentially adjust the setup of the farm for it to work on your computer. So you should really not skip ahead to the tutorial, or you will probably have problems. While in this video I will focus on the Ominous Vault because of its much more interesting loot, everything we will see also works on the regular vault. The regular vault has some unique loot like tridents, mending books, as well as its own music disc, armor trim and banner patterns, which could make it interesting for some people to farm as well. This farm is very powerful, but comes with a couple drawbacks. They are explained in the chunk save setting video, but I'll quickly summarize them here. Firstly, it does not work on multiplayer. Well, hold up right there! Actually, that's not true anymore. Yes, I did find a way to use it on a server without rendering it unplayable for the other players. Yippee! The setup is more complex though and will require its own video, but I am already working on it. In the meantime, only use this in single player. Second issue, it is not very fast. It relies on letting the game unload the chunk to reset the vault, and that can take varying amount of time on different computers. On mine, it takes 2 to 3 minutes to reset the chunk, but it might take longer on yours. That can be improved if you can get 2 vaults in a single chunk, as you would still need to wait 2 minutes between each reset, but you'd be opening 2 vaults every time, essentially doubling your vault loot. But even if I say that it is slow, 20 volts per hour is still much faster than trying to go exploring to find more vaults by yourself. And since it's the only farm of this kind, it is technically the fastest. Also, like previously stated, the performance of the farm will vary depending on your computer. The setup will also have to be adjusted based on your render distance, and if your game has less than 3 GB of memory allocated, more adjustments will be required. It should still work regardless, as long as you properly follow the setup instructions for your specific situation. It will also increase your world size by 2 GB. Nowadays I don't expect hard drive space to be an issue for most people, but just in case I thought it was worth mentioning. Lastly, it is expensive to set up. It requires a lot of books, feathers and ink, as well as a lot of shackled boxes. If you want to build it, start by making farms to acquire these items in large quantities. All in all, these drawbacks are quite minor in my opinion when you compare them to the benefits. You'll also need to have a large supply of ominous keys which you can build farms for. I won't be covering that in this video, but rest assured that I will make a video about it at some point. I'll put a link in the description when I do make it. So, how does it work? Well, I'm not gonna explain it in too much details, as the previous video already explains it quite well, but I'll do a quick recap. The way we reuse the same vault is by making the game forget that we opened it in the first place. To do that, before we use the vault, we will fill the chunk with so much data that any saving attempt will fail for that specific chunk. But we can still interact with the chunk normally in the meantime, so we can use our key and get our loot and push it in a different chunk that will be saved normally. Then, once all the loot has been stored safely, we unload the chunk, which will force the game to save it. Minecraft will try really hard to save that chunk and try not to lose any data. So we need to give it time to try a few times until it gives up. That is what this system is for. It will wait a certain amount of time, and when that amount has passed, it will send a minecart back for another round. And since the game could not save the chunk, it won't be able to remember that we used the vault, so we can use it again, and again, and again. Alright, but how do we fill the chunk with data while being completely AFK? If you remember, last time we had to manually unstack a pile of books from a chest. But since we're gonna be AFK, we can't be opening chests and moving books around, so we have to use a machine for that. And that is exactly what this one does. NTHNH helped me with the first iteration, but I've been improving it to make it faster and faster and faster. It was important to make it faster for 2 reasons. First, the faster it operates, the faster we can use the farm. But also, it is really complicated to make it unload safe. While it should not matter much in this case, as when we first load the machine it is idle, and we wait for the machine to be finished before we open the vault and unload the area, there is an issue if the game manages to autosave while the machine is working. It is possible that the autosaves trigger before the machine reaches the tipping point that would prevent saving. The issue with that is when we reload the chunk, the machine will resume its work from somewhere in the middle, and depending in what phase it was saved in, it could break and not be able to set up the save state properly. You can see where that could be an issue. We can't use the vault without the save state or we would not be able to reuse it. Fortunately, I had built a lot of phase saves in the machine to prevent the risk of breakage. And if breakage was to happen, the vault would stay sealed, so there was no risk of using it without the save state in place. But I needed the machine to be as fast as possible to really make the chance of an autosave jamming it almost impossible. And I made good progress. I found out the perfect timings to unlock hoppers at a tick perfect moment so that every game tick a different hopper from the chain was unlocked. The only issue was that bottom hopper that needed to move 2 items before the other could start the next loop. And I had found a solution for that. I was gonna use a double chest so I could have 2 hoppers operating on the chest at once and the system would work twice as fast. And then I just realized that instead of that complicated mess, I could just use something like that. Just 1 chest, 2 hoppers, and a piston to unlock both hoppers at once. What's neat with this system is that there is no way for it to break. It is either not active, and so in a state that can be saved, or active, but the instant the piston gets activated, the hoppers are unlocked instantly and the 2 books are spread across the hoppers, preventing the save. So it literally cannot break. The one downside is that it requires a more precise control of the size of the chunk, but since each book is roughly 300 megabytes, it's quite easy to find a sweet spot. I have this barrel here containing 9 books which does exactly that. So, to recapitulate, Minecraft will not save the content of a chunk if there is too many books spread out in the chest. We have a machine to spread the books while we are AFK that will not break. All we have to do is make the player hold right click, which we can do with the F3 plus T trick. But now we need to unload the chunk for the game to save it while being AFK. There is 2 ways to do that. The first way involves Nether portals. The easiest in my opinion is to use a minecart to move the player around, as since 1.21 we can ride minecarts into Nether portals, but if you are playing on an older version, you could use pistons or water. There is another thing to keep in mind about minecarts and Nether portals. Before 1.21.2, your orientation would be reset when you traverse a portal. This has been fixed in that version, but again, if you play in another version, you'll have to make sure that the orientation the player is forced into will give him access to the vault block. Although that's easily solvable with a bunch of rails. While I originally thought that Nether portals are the easiest way to unload the chunk, there is sadly a couple issues with them. The first one, which I was not aware of, is that they reset the clicking state of the player. In other words, going through a portal breaks the F3 plus T trick, which means if you want to use portals to move an AFK player around, you will need to physically put something on your mouse to hold it pressed or use an auto-clicker. We also need to wait for the game to give up trying to save the chunk, which is why we have this clock. It might look complex, but it's a simple hopper clock with a few extra bells and whistles. And lastly, what I originally thought of a good thing about Nether portals, but is turning out to be a bad one, is that they load the chunk violently. So the game is forced to do the loading ASAP, and for that reason it will freeze all other functions, which is why the game freezes when getting back to the overworld. But fortunately, that's not the only way to unload the chunk. We can also just move the player really far and that would work as well. This has a couple advantages. You can use the F3 plus T trick since you are not going through a portal anymore. It works in versions where Minecart with players didn't go through portals. For reasons I will explain later, we shouldn't need a hopper clock anymore. And lastly, this is the only version that will work on servers. Again, do not attempt to build this on the server just yet. Be patient, it's not ready yet. The only downside with this method is figuring out how far you have to move the player. I thought this was gonna be pretty straightforward, as I just need to get the chunk out of the simulation distance and it will be unloaded, right? Well, that did not work, and this led me into a rabbit hole of understanding how the game loads and unloads chunk and how render distance and simulation distance actually work. First, the simulation distance you select in your settings might not be the actual value that the game is using. If your render distance is set to a lower value than the simulation distance, the game will override the simulation distance with the render distance instead. Which makes sense, because why would you simulate parts of the world that you can't even see? But, if you are using Bobby mod, keep in mind that this setting will override your simulation distance if it is enabled. However, if your render distance is bigger, then both options will behave as expected and the game will simulate a smaller amount of chunk that it will render. But simulation distance only dictates the amount of chunks that will be entity ticking. What happens to the extra chunks loaded by my higher render distance? Well, obviously they count extra, but let's ignore that case for now and assume the render distance equals the simulation distance. Alright, so we have the real simulation distance value, and that should be the number of chunks we have to move in order to unload the chunk, no? Well, not so fast. As you might know, the game loads a few more chunks around the player that are known as lazy chunks and border chunks, as they are useful to make mob switches. But what is not very known, however, is the inaccessible chunks. I have never heard of any contraption using them, but they do matter here, as these chunks are still loaded. While there is only one ring of lazy chunk and one ring of border chunks, there is a total of 11 rings of inaccessible chunks. So even with a simulation distance of 2, we will need to get the player at least 15 chunks away from the vault in order to unload it. Note that if your under distance is bigger than your simulation distance, then these extra chunks loaded by your under distance will increase the number of border chunks. Here, my under distance is 4 more than my simulation distance, so instead of 1 border chunk, I will have a total of 5. And that is the final number of chunks I need to travel in order to unload the vault. So, the generic formula looks like this. Simulation distance plus 1 for lazy chunks, plus 1 plus render distance minus simulation distance for the border chunks, and plus 11 for inaccessible chunks is equal to the number of chunks loaded. We can notice something here is that we have simulation distance twice, so we could simplify this formula. If we move things around a bit, we end up with this, where you can easily see that we are subtracting simulation distance to itself, so we can just get rid of it, and we get a final formula to compute the loaded chunk distance. I know that it's strange that I went to look deeply into how the unloading of chunks from memory really works when we already had a working method with the Nether portals. But this has an advantage. Using this method instead of the Nether, we unload the chunk progressively, and the game will begin the saving process, and thus the 2-minute timer, before we actually reach the point where we force unload the chunk. And by the time we reach that point, the game will have tried to save the chunk, realized it does not work, and will have given up on it already. It still has the chunk loaded in memory though, so if we were to go back, it would not have reset, but the moment that we get that chunk out of the inaccessible chunks, the game will unload it instantly, since it already tried to save it. Which is why we don't need a hopper clock here. We can just send the minecart back instantly when we reach that point, not the extra repeaters, which give time to the player to shut off the system when he wants to stop using it. Alright, so now we have everything we need to build an AFK vault farm. Let's go over the material you will need to gather before building it. As mentioned before, the farm will require more than 5 shulker boxes of books, insects, and feathers. It will also require a little over 5 stacks of shulker boxes. That's a lot of shulker shells and chests. I would recommend that you start making an ink farm, a shulker farm, a bamboo farm with chest auto-crafting, a chicken farm for feathers, and sugarcane plus hoglin farms for the books. A quick note about these numbers. They are assuming your game has 3 GB of RAM or more. I would even recommend 4 GB to be safe. If you have less, you will not need that many books, but I can't tell you how many. It will depend on a bunch of factors and I have no way to account for them all. You will have to build it in a creative world first by following the steps normally, but not filling up all the chests at once. You will need to test how many chests your game can take before it stops saving them. Again, if you have 3 GB or more, you should be able to follow the instructions normally without worrying about that. Now, that was only the materials for the chunk save setting. You will need additional materials depending on how you want to unload the chunk. If you want to use the Nether portal method, you will only need some obsidian for the portal and the redstone component to build a fancy hopper clock. If you want to use the minecart tunnel method, you will need a bunch of pickaxes and a lot of rails. The Nether portal is faster to set up, but requires an external autoclicker. If you want a custom autoclicker, I wrote a simple one using AutoHotkey, which I will link in the description. It is simple enough that you should be able to modify it to suit your needs if needed. You will also need to build the clock, which comes in 2 versions as well. A version that goes up to 2 minutes 8 seconds and is cheaper to build, and a version that can go much higher, like 11 hours or more. The one you will need to build depends on how long you need to stay in the Nether for your computer to unload the chunk. I recommend that you download this map and test that first, so you know which one you need to build and how many items you need inside of it. Try to find the smaller amount of items you need, as it will increase the speed at which you can reuse the vaults. We will cover both these clocks in the building tutorial. If you can't or don't want to use an autoclicker, you will need to use the tunnel method. Remember that the number of chunks you need to mine through depends on your real simulation distance and render distance. Please compute it using the formula we saw earlier, and that will give you the number of chunks you need between the vault chunk and your minecart return station. In order to reduce that amount, you can lower your simulation and render distance when you build the farm, but you will need to remember to always turn them down when you want to use the farm, otherwise it won't work. Note that you might still need to add a clock to this design as well if your computer takes a long time to save the chunk. Same as for the Nether option, you should test that on this map first, and if you need a clock, run tests to figure the amount of items you need. Remember that the map download is in the description. This map is configured for a render distance of 6. Make sure you lower it before opening it to avoid loading the vault instantly. To test the minecart track without a clock, use this lever. To use the clock, turn it off and use this lever instead. Then hop in the minecart and click the button. To test the Nether method, when you reach the vault, break the rails and light up the portal. Then after using the vault, you will be sent back to the Nether. Don't forget to enable the clock and then wait. Once you have tested what components of the farm you need to build, you need to find a spot to build it. You will need to find a trial chamber, since we need a chunk with an ominous vault. If you also want to find the regular vault, you need a chunk that contains both vaults. During my testing, most of the trial chamber I explored had at least one chunk with both type of vaults, so that should be easy to find. However, if you only care about diamonds and maces, and you want to double the efficiency of the farm, you will need to find a chunk with 2 ominous vaults within it. That was much more rare, but I did find one trial chamber that barely generated 2 ominous vaults in the same chunk. I had to explore roughly 20 trial chambers, and while a few were very close, only one actually had 2 vaults in the same chunk. So I guess this is quite rare, but could be worth it to search for. If you have access to your seed, or know where your save folder is located, you can use websites like Chunkbase to locate structures like trial chambers in your world. I would recommend you explore them in a creative copy of your world so you can easily teleport between them and look for the perfect chunk that contains everything you want to farm. As mentioned on the original save setting video, this should be relatively far from your base as loading it violently will cause your game to lag for a while. To mitigate that issue, when you build a nether portal that you will use to fast travel to the farm, you can place it further away from the farm so that it doesn't instantly load it when you go through. The portal should be at least 3 chunks plus your render distance away from the farm. If you are going to lower your simulation and render distance when using the farm, doing it before passing the portal will allow you to have the portal closer to the farm. And that is all you need to know before building the farm. Time for the building tutorial. Here are the items you will need for the chunk safe setting part. Once you have found your perfect chunk, note down the coordinates, go back to your survival world, grab all the resources, and go to the nether. Divide the overworld coordinate by 8, and that will give you the location of your nether portal. I would recommend to build it on the nether roof, so it is easier to access. As mentioned before, you should move that portal later on to minimize lag once the farm is built. But for now it does not matter. You will need to dig your way to the exact coordinates of your chunk. Once there, clear out the space so you have easy access to all your vaults. Now we will build the chunk safe setting machine. You can follow the instructions on the chunk safe setting video for more details. As a reminder, we need 12 columns of 3 barrels or chest. Each chest will be filled with 9 choco boxes of books. The one difference with that video is that after placing the extra chest with 8 choco boxes in it, we will not place the chest with one stack of 16 books, but instead a double chest with a stack of 2 books. Then, on the side, we will add an extra barrel with 9 books. Since each book is quite big, you will probably need the same amount of books, but you can try to add them gradually just in case. Also, a quick reminder that if your game is running with less than 3GB of RAM, you should not place all the chests at once. You should try to gradually place more chests, making sure to save and quick between placing a few of them, until you reach a point where you can't place another chest. The amount of books you will need in a barrel will probably also vary. Make sure that the world can save in this state. Once you have confirmed that it saves, try to split the 2 book stack. This time, the books should magically stack back together. If the books stay unstacked, stack them back, add 1 more book to the barrel, save and quit, and try again. Once you have confirmed that the books will magically stack back together when you reload the world, you can build the rest of the system. It is quite simple, only requiring a piston with a block of redstone, powering 2 hoppers pointing in different directions. It is very important that the hoppers are not facing into each other. It does not matter which way they are facing otherwise. We measure the chest with a comparator to make sure that the vault stays sealed while the books are stacked, so we can only open the vault when the chunk is in a state that cannot be saved. Now, we need to build a player station. Here are the items you will need for this. We will drop the player onto 3 unpowered powered rails so that the player is forced to stop here. Place a regular rail on both sides so the power doesn't leak from future rails. We will use an observer and a string to detect when the player enters the station. You could also use a detector rail. Place somewhere a dropper filled with keys that we will trigger when you open the vault. Finish the relay to the vault block, ensuring the player will have line of sight on the last rail, which should be an unpowered powered rail, followed by a solid block. Time to connect it all up. Connect the observer or detector rail to the piston, so that entering the player's station results in the piston pushing the redstone block away. Then, connect the comparator output of the chest to a torch that will power the dropper and the rails. Also, connect this to another torch that will keep the vault sealed with a sticky piston pushing a block. Ensure the piston will reveal the face of the vault the player will be aligned with. Cover all of the faces of the vault to prevent accidental opening. Now, for the item collection system. Locate the closest chunk border. Place a hopper 1 block below the vault. Make sure it points towards the closest chunk border. Place a rail with a hopper minecart on it, so that the minecart sits right below the vault. Do not break the rail. Use as many hopper chest combos as you need to get the items across the chunk border ASAP. Then, prepare some storage area with a bunch of chests. You could also build Choco Box loaders or any type of storage system you want. I'll stick with a wall of chests here. If your chunk border is quite far, you might be able to use a dropper with a water tunnel to drive the items away and ensure they will not be rolled back since they would be stored as entities. But I haven't tested it. We will now add safety mechanisms to ensure we don't unload the vault before all the items have been extracted. Behind the vault, add an observer observing the vault. Place a solid block after the observer, followed by a dropper. Move the solid block one to the side and add a sticky piston behind it, so it can push back the block in place. Connect that piston to the line that will open the vault when the chest is empty. Piston should not be powered by default. Place 4 junk items in the dropper. Read from the dropper with a comparator. Connect this comparator through a 4-tick repeater to a torch that will power the rail in front of the vault. That torch should be off by default since there is items in the dropper. The system is technically functional as is, but we will add one last failsafe that will also make it more reliable. Locate the last hopper or chest before the chunk border. Get a comparator output from it and run that into a repeater. This repeater will power a torch and a line of redstone that will join the comparator output from the dropper. So if either of them has items, the player should be forced to wait on the powered rail. Lastly, go back to that last torch, connect it to a 4-tick repeater pointing into a block sitting on top of a piston. And on the other side of that block, draw a line of redstone that will inject in the same block the observer is pointing to. That line of redstone will connect to the extended arm of the piston, but when the piston will retract, it will be in line with the block. And that's it for the vault safe setting system. Now we will need to build a path that will allow you to unload the vault once you have used it. Follow accordingly depending on which method you want to use. For the Nether portal, here is the list of materials you will need. You will first create a Nether portal at the end of the tracks and light it up. Take note of the direction the rails are facing into the portal. If, when you go through the portal, it generates sideways and the direction you are looking for does not align with the portal, then break it and rotate it 90 degrees. Once the portal faces the right axis, looking away from the portal, you should be looking at the cardinal direction you noted earlier. This is the side of the portal you need to build the player station on. Next, place some tracks running out of the portal into what will be the minecart holding station. Place a detector rail followed by a regular rail and an unpowered powered rail facing into a solid block. Place a minecart on that rail. Place a button on the solid block to power the rail when you want to start the farm. Now, build a wall next to the rails with a redstone lamp in the middle. Place a lever on that lamp. This will be the on-off lever. Don't forget to turn the lamp on when you want to use the farm, and turn it off when you want to stop it. Now, place a copper bulb below or next to the detector rail. Place a button on that copper bulb. The button is there so you can reset the state of the copper bulb if needed. The copper bulb should always be on before you hop on the minecart and press the start button. If you need to reset the copper bulb, make sure the lever is turned off before you do so. Now, we will cover the clocks. You only need to build one, and again, you should test if the small 2-minute clock is enough for you, or if you need the big clock. In case of doubt, I would recommend to build a big one, as you can also adjust it to be a 2-minute or lower. For the small clock, here are the items you will need. First, place a comparator behind the copper bulb, pointing it to a solid block with the second copper bulb underneath. Then, place another comparator pointing towards the portal, and add an observer looking at that comparator into a solid block. Now, place a redstone torch behind the lamp. Connect 2 pieces of redstone dust, then down 1 block and another redstone dust that should end up above the observer. Place a sticky piston above the block. If the lever is turned off, it should extend and remove the block from the observer. Now, we will build the actual clock. Place 4 blocks next to the observer like so, and place the 4 rails on top. The extended piston head should be touching one of the rails. Aligned with the topmost 2 rails, place 2 regular pistons facing each other, with a redstone block between them. On top of the redstone block, place 2 hoppers facing each other and cover them with composters. At the back of the hoppers, place 2 comparators reading them facing into a block. Place a rail next to both pistons and cover them with blocks. The comparators should look completely encased like this. Place redstone dust in both corners. Next, place another block after the dust with a torch on top. The torches should point into a solid block, then fill the 2x3 area between the torches and composters. Place comparators in the middle, pointing towards the composters. Make sure to toggle subtraction mode and add a block on each side of the comparators. Cover the blocks with redstone. Next, on the side closer to the minecart station, add a repeater 1 block down with a piece of redstone pointing towards a sticky piston with a block on top. After the block, add a repeater on 4 ticks. Now place the last sticky piston next to the redstone torch facing down. Ensure the lever is off so the piston is extended. Give a block to the piston and connect the repeater to the powered rail, making sure that the block of the piston is cutting the signal. That piston is part of the on-off mechanism and will prevent the clock to trigger the minecart if it triggers after you have turned the machine off. Toggle the lever and check that the redstone does connect once retracted. All that is left to do is to load the hoppers with the required amount of items. Each item will add 0.4 seconds to the timer. This clock can work with as little as 2 items or up to 5 stacks. For the double hopper clock, here are the items you will need. While the small one is quite compact, I did not spend much time trying to compact this one. Feel free to compact it wherever you see fit. To build it, we will start from the minecart station exactly how we started for the small one, by adding a comparator after the copper bulb. This time we will run straight into the second copper bulb, followed by a second comparator into a node block. Place something on top of the node block to mute it. Add an observer below it, observing that node block. Leave a 2 block gap below the observer and add a sticky piston with a block on top. The piston should be able to push that block into the observer. Place a torch behind the redstone lamp with a sticky piston facing down. There should be a gap between the torch and the piston. Give a block to the piston and a redstone torch below that block. Now, to the side of that torch, add a block with another torch. This should power the piston we placed earlier. Add a redstone dust on top to turn that torch off. Now back to that piston. Place 2 blocks at the same level that the one we already have, and 2 more 1 block higher. Place rails on these 4 blocks. Make sure one of the bottom rails is between the observer and the block on the piston. Now, place 2 regular pistons next to the topmost rails facing each other with a redstone block between them. Place 2 hoppers facing each other on top and cover them with composters. On each side, place a comparator pointing into a block with redstone below. Place a torch in front of the block and run 2 redstone dust below. After the redstone, place a piston with a block on top. Then take a repeater on 2 ticks from both pistons and connect them with redstone. Place 2 target blocks in the middle with redstone torches on top. Next to the torches, place the last 2 rails. Now, we are gonna build a second clock, so like before, regular pistons next to the rails, redstone block and hoppers on top, capped off with composters. Then comparators on each side, pointing into a block with redstone dust below. We'll finish that clock in a moment, but for now, let's finish the first one. We need to update the rails every time we pause a second clock with a bit of extra delay. So we will come down from the torches with a bit of redstone into the repeater on 4 ticks. Connect both with redstone and add another repeater on 4 ticks next to the piston. Place an observer on this repeater pointing up. It's not currently connected to the rails, but we'll do that shortly. Back to the second clock. Add a torch on the blocks the comparators are pointing to. Add a block above the torches and on the side. Then cover the composters with blocks and cover them with redstone. To avoid to QC the pistons, use slabs on the side of the composters or just move the blocks 1 block up. Add another block against the torches with redstone on top. Place comparators in subtraction mode between the redstone dust pointing towards the first clock and add a block with redstone on top. Connect them with redstone. On the side with the minecart, add a repeater 1 block down, going into a sticky piston with a block on top. After the piston, add 2 dust and a 4-tick repeater pointing into a block with redstone dust below. Next to the redstone torch on the lamp, leave a gap and place a block with redstone on top. Place a downwards facing sticky piston next to that block and give it a block. The extended piston arm should be at the same level than the redstone dust. Now connect that dust to the powered rail, making sure that the block of the piston is cutting the signal. That piston is part of the on-off mechanism and will prevent the clock to trigger the minecart if it triggers after you have turned the machine off. Toggle the lever and check that the redstone does connect once retracted. Then turn it off. Now, back to the top comparators. On the other side of the one with a repeater, extend by 1 block and add a torch on top. From that torch, make a path for redstone that connects into a sticky piston that will push a block on the observer we forgot about earlier. This completes the circuit and will allow the first clock to auto-restart every time the back clock advances 1 item. To make sure the piston is not activated by this redstone dust, place a button behind it like this. All that is left to do is to load the hoppers with the required amount of items. You need at least 2 items in the back clock and 4 in the front one. To know how long your clock lasts, multiply the number of items in both clocks, then multiply all that by 0.4, and you have the number of seconds the clock will last for. There is also roughly a 1 second delay between each tick of the back clock, so you might want to add items in the back clock -1 to account for it. For the minecart tunnel method, you will need a lot of rails, basically 16 rails per chunk you want to travel. As a reminder, the number of chunk is your render distance plus 13. All these rails don't need to be powered rails. You technically can have as much as 37 normal rails between each powered rail. If you don't want to count to 37, just place 1 every chunk or 1 every 2 chunk. You'll also need 3 extra powered rail for the minecart station. So with your number of chunk you need to dig, multiply it by 16 and you have the total number of rails you need. To get the number of powered rails, either divide that number by 37, or if you plan on having 1 powered rail every 2 chunks, divide the number of chunks by 2 and take that instead. Then add +3 powered rails for the station. All you need to do is continue the rail track in a straight line. You can enable chunk borders with F3+G to better count the chunks and know where to stop. We are counting the chunks between the chunk of the vault and the final chunk. So once you have digged all your chunks, you will need to dig a few more blocks into the next one where we will build our station. To build the station, if you need to build clocks, follow the instructions on the Nether portal, ignoring of course the Nether portal part. But you will probably not need one, so instead let's build a cheap station. Here are the items you will need for that cheap station. Make sure you place at least 2 power rails in that new chunk before you build the station. Then, add a detector rail, a regular rail, and the last power rail. Above the rail, add a button to start the farm. To make it truly AFK, we will build an on-off lever for the farm. Next to the block of the powered rail, place a second one and a sticky piston behind it. Place a node block above the piston with a block on top to mute it. Then, place a block next to the node block and add redstone against that new block. Next to that redstone, place a lamp with a lever. If the lamp is off, it means the farm is off. Now, turn on the lamp and place some repeaters going from the detector rail, doing a small loop and ending up in the block of the piston. Place the minecart on that last rail and the farm is ready. When the minecart returns to the station, it will pass on the detector rail and activate the repeaters, which will send it back. To stop the farm, turn the lever off before you are sent back. Feel free to add as many repeaters as you need to comfortably turn the lever off in time. To use the farm, make sure the lever is on, and if you are using the clock, make sure the copper bulb is on. Then, get in the minecart and press the button. The minecart will be sent back every time you get back to the station. If you want to stop the farm, turn off the lever before the minecart is sent back. When you want to use it again, just turn the lever back on and hop into the minecart. Again, if you are using the clock, make sure the copper bulb is on. If the copper bulb is off, then turn the lever off, click the button to reset the bulb, and wait for the clock to reset. Once the clock has reset, you can turn the lever back on and click the button as usual. Then, once you reach the vault, aim at it with your key and either enable your auto-clicker or use the F3 plus T trick to keep right-clicking while AFK. To do the F3 plus T trick, simply hold right-click and then press F3 plus T, wait for the screen to turn red, and then release your mouse. The game will keep clicking even if you are not holding it anymore. Now, while making sure you don't move the mouse, Alt-tab to a different window and go do something else while the game is farming vaults for you. When you want to stop the farm, go back to Minecraft and right-click once to disable the F3 trick. Then, wait to return to the minecart station and turn off the lever. If you are using the minecart tunnel and the vault is not resetting, then you did not dig a long enough tunnel. Check again that you got the correct value from the loaded chunk distance and either lower your settings or dig a longer tunnel and move back the minecart station. If you did the math correctly and it is still not working, then maybe you need to wait longer at the minecart return station for your computer to unload the vault. In that case, you will need to build a clock instead of the cheap minecart station. If you are using Nether portals, you have to use an auto-clicker. I will link a simple one I made using AutoHotkey in the description. It has the added benefit of sending click 7 to the game directly, which means you don't have to keep the game focused with this auto-clicker. You can also change the delay of clicks in milliseconds, change to left clicks if you want to use it for a looting farm, and change the shortcut key here. It is currently set to Windows plus Z, which is not a shortcut used by anything else to my knowledge. To use it, first focus the Minecraft window you want to activate the auto-clicker for, if you have multiple ones, then hit the shortcut to activate it. You will hear a different sound when it turns on versus off. Once it has been turned on, it will remember which Minecraft window it was activated on, so you can safely Alt-tab to a different window. To turn it off, just use the same shortcut and then wait for the minecart station where you can turn off the lever. And there we have it! A complete guide into ominous vault farming and, to my knowledge, the only way to renewably farm the maze. As mentioned, I have a way to make it work on multiplayer, but it will take me a while to make that video, so please be patient. It's coming, I promise. I hope you guys will have fun with this, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I would appreciate if you could leave a like, as this video took way too much effort to make. If you have any issue, please ask in the comment or in the Discord, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya!